Hey guys, welcome back to Coin and Cross. If you've been walking through this foundation series with me, you know we're building something intentional here, a biblical framework for how men think about purpose, goals, and obedience. My name is Mark, and this channel exists to help you think clearly about what God says, not what Christian culture says or assumes. And so far, we've talked about how God sets goals, why most Christian goal setting fails, the difference between calling and ambition, why obedience matters more than results. And today, we're addressing something that creates a lot of confusion for Christian men. What does Scripture actually teach about planning? Because here's the tension. God is sovereign. He is in control. So does that mean we just pray and wait, or are we supposed to plan, strategize, and execute? And if we do plan, does that show a lack of faith? Let's settle this biblically. For a long time, I thought planning was unspiritual, for the most part. I genuinely believe that if I really trusted God, I wouldn't need a plan. I thought that making detailed plans, setting timelines, mapping out steps, all of that was just self-reliance dressed up in productivity language. So I prayed, I waited, I asked God to show me the next step, and I convinced myself that sitting in that was a posture of faith. But it wasn't faith, it was passivity. And passivity is not a biblical virtue. Here's what I've learned since then. God commands planning, but he also commands surrender. Planning is not the opposite of faith. Planning without surrender is the opposite of faith. And there's a massive difference between the two. So today, we're going to look at what Scripture actually says about planning. Not what we assume it says, not what sounds spiritual, what it actually says. And we're going to clarify how to plan faithfully without falling into self-reliance. Before we get into it, if this series has helped you at all, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps other men find this content, and I'm grateful, very grateful for your support. All right, let's get to it. Let me start by addressing the lie head on. Planning is not unspiritual. In fact, Scripture commands it. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 5 says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to plenty, but those of everyone who is hasty surely to poverty." Notice that what the verse does not say. It doesn't say pray and wait for provision. It says the plans of the diligent lead to plenty. Planning is tied to diligence. Diligence is tied to provision. That's not self-reliance, that's stewardship. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 3 says, "Commit your works to the Lord, and your thoughts will be established." You commit your works, meaning your plans, your efforts, your strategy, to the Lord. You don't sit idle and wait for him to do it for you. You work, you plan, and you commit those plans to him. Proverbs chapter 24, verse 27 says, "Prepare your outside work, make it fit for yourself in the field, and afterward build your house." That's an instruction to plan strategically. Do the foundational work first. Sequence your priorities. Don't build the house before you've prepared the field. That's wisdom. That's planning. Luke chapter 14, verses 28 through 30, Jesus says, "For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it, lest after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.'" Jesus himself teaches that planning is necessary. counting the cost, assessing resources, thinking through steps before you start. That's not lack of faith, that's wisdom. So let's be clear, God commands planning. If you think planning shows a lack of faith, you're not being spiritual, you're being lazy and calling it trust, just like I was. Now, here's the other side of the coin. Planning is commanded, but planning is not the same thing as controlling outcomes. And this is where most men fall into two ditches. Ditch one, passivity disguised as faith. I'll just pray and wait for God to show me. That's not faith. That's abdication of responsibility. God gave you a brain, resources, and agency. Use them. Ditch two, self-reliance disguised as stewardship. I've got a 5-year plan, a backup plan, and contingencies for every scenario. I'm good. That's not stewardship. That's control. And control is just pride in planning language. The biblical middle ground is this: plan faithfully, but hold outcomes loosely. James chapter 4, verses 13 through 15 makes this crystal clear. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. Notice what James is not saying. He's not saying don't make plans. The people in that passage had a plan. They were going to a city. They were going to buy and sell. They were going to make a profit. That's detailed planning. James isn't rebuking them for planning. He's rebuking them for planning without acknowledging God's sovereignty. They planned as if the outcome was guaranteed, as if their effort alone determined the result, as if God was irrelevant to the equation. And that's the trap. Not planning itself, but planning as if we're in control. So here's the framework. Write this down if you need to. You are responsible for the plan. God is responsible for the outcome. Your job is to steward what's in front of you with wisdom, diligence, and intentionality. God's job is to determine what happens after you obey. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9 says it perfectly. A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. You plan, that's your responsibility. But God directs, that's his. You don't abdicate planning because God's in control. You also don't cling to your plan as if the outcome depends entirely on you. You plan faithfully and you surrender the results to God. Here's what that looks like practically. Plan with wisdom. Use the mind God gave you. Set goals. Map out steps. Count the cost. Think strategically. That's obedience. Pray over your plans. Commit them to the Lord. Ask him to redirect you if you're off course. Submit your strategy to his authority. Execute faithfully. Don't plan and then wait for God to do it for you. Work the plan. That's stewardship. Hold outcomes loosely. Be willing to adjust. Be willing to let God close doors. Be willing to have your plans redirected entirely. Because the goal is not your plan succeeding. The goal is God's will being done. That's the posture. Plan like it depends on you. Trust like it depends on God. Because both are true. Let me give you a concrete example. Let's say you're starting a business. You believe God has called you to it. You've prayed. You've sought counsel. You're moving forward. The wrong approach. Number one, passivity. I'm just going to pray and see what God does. If he wants this business to succeed, he'll make it happen. No business plan, no financial projections, no strategy, just hoping God fills in the gaps. That's not faith. That's irresponsibility. The wrong approach number 2, control. I've got a bulletproof 5-year plan. I've accounted for every variable. I know exactly how this is going to play out, and I'm going to execute it perfectly. No room for God to redirect. No acknowledgement of his sovereignty, just self-reliance with a prayer tacked on at the end. That's not stewardship, that's pride. The right approach, biblical planning, is I'm going to build a solid business plan. I'm going to count the cost. I'm going to work diligently and strategically, but I'm holding all of it with open hands. If God redirects me, I'll pivot. If he closes a door I thought was open, I'll trust him. If the outcome doesn't match my plan, I'll still be faithful to what he's put in front of me today. That's biblical planning. That's a posture that God honors. You plan, you work, you steward, but you don't worship the plan. You worship the one who holds the outcome. Here's how you know if you're planning faithfully or trying to control outcomes. Ask yourself this question. If God redirected my plan tomorrow, would I be okay? Not would it be hard. Of course it would be hard, but would you be able to surrender it? Or would you fight to keep your plan intact because you've built your identity around it? If the plan failing feels like you failing, you've crossed into the line of control. If you can hold the plan loosely, knowing that God might use it exactly as you laid it out, or he might tear it up entirely and do something completely different, then you're planning faithfully. Second question, am I planning because I trust God or because I don't? Are you planning because you believe God has given you responsibility to steward and you're doing it in obedience? Or are you planning because you're afraid that if you don't control every detail, it's all going to fall apart? One is faith, the other is fear. Third question, am I willing to adjust when God makes it clear that I need to? Because sometimes God will bless your plan exactly as you laid it out. And sometimes he'll interrupt it on day one and send you in a completely different direction. Both are his kindness. And if you can't see that, you're not planning faithfully. You're just trying to control outcomes and calling it obedience. Let me bring this home. Planning is not unspiritual. Passivity is not faith. And self-reliance is not stewardship. God commands you to plan. He also commands you to surrender. Plan faithfully. Hold outcomes loosely. Your responsibility is wisdom, diligence, and obedience. God's responsibility is the result. And when you get that locked in, when we get that locked in, we can plan with full intentionality while holding the outcome with an open hand. You'll experience a freedom that most Christian men never find, because you'll stop living like the success of the plan depends on you. You'll start living like a man who knows the one in control is trustworthy. In our next video, we're going to talk about something that ties all of this together. Faithfulness is not passive. Because here's what I've noticed. A lot of Christian men here trust God and think that means do nothing. They confuse waiting on God with sitting still. They mistake surrender for inaction. But faithfulness is not passive. It's active. It's disciplined. It costs you something. That's video number 7. And it's going to challenge the version of faith that looks a lot like laziness. Until then, plan faithfully, hold outcomes loosely, and trust the one who holds it all. I'll see you in the next one.